When Evelyn Carter dismissed her driver's quiet warning about a $100 million deal, she thought she was protecting her reputation as the youngest CEO in her father's company. She had no idea that the man behind the wheel possessed 8 years of warehouse expertise that would either save her empire or expose how dangerously out of touch she'd become with reality. What started as a 20-minute car ride to the most important investor meeting of her life was about to unravel everything she thought she knew about power, intelligence, and the people she'd been overlooking her entire career. But Marcus Hill had learned long ago that smart men in his position don't speak up, until the woman he's quietly falling for is about to destroy herself with her own pride. By the time that red light turned green, both their worlds would be forever changed, and the real question wasn't whether she'd listen to him, but whether either of them could survive what happened when she finally did. If you're watching this story unfold, subscribe and tell me where you're from, because this journey of unexpected love and hard-learned lessons is just getting started. The early morning air was crisp as Marcus Hill stood beside his black sedan, checking his watch. 6:15. Evelyn Carter would be out in exactly 5 minutes. She was always punctual, always composed, always ready to take on whatever the day would throw at her. He straightened his tie and brushed a piece of lint from his dark suit jacket. After 3 months of driving for her, he knew her routine by heart. She'd appear at the front door of her brick townhouse with her phone pressed to her ear, already deep into her first business call of the day. She'd nod at him politely, slide into the back seat, and spend the 20-minute drive to her office building coordinating meetings and making decisions that moved millions of dollars. Marcus respected that about her. Evelyn Carter didn't waste time or energy on small talk. She was focused, driven, and completely in control of everything around her. At 29, she was the youngest CEO her father's investment firm had ever seen. She'd earned every bit of that success. The front door opened right on schedule. Evelyn stepped out, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. Her phone was already at her ear. "Good morning, Marcus," she said with a quick smile as he opened the car door for her. "Morning, Ms. Carter." She settled into the leather seat and immediately returned to her call. "Linda, I need you to pull the quarterly reports before the meeting." "Yes, all of them. We can't afford any surprises today." Marcus pulled away from the curb and merged into the morning traffic. Through the rearview mirror, he watched Evelyn flip through a thick folder of papers while balancing her phone between her shoulder and ear. Today was the big day. He'd been driving her to preparation meetings all week for this investor deal. "The timeline looks aggressive," she was saying to whoever was on the other end. "But we've done the math 3 times. The logistics costs are manageable, and the return projections are solid." Marcus kept his eyes on the road, but something about what she'd just said made him frown slightly. He'd overheard enough of these conversations over the past few days to know the basic details. A major shipping expansion that would cost the company nearly $100 million. New warehouses, new contracts, new everything. But the timeline she kept mentioning didn't sound right to him. "Tell the investors we'll have full operations running by the 4th quarter, Evelyn continued. "The new facilities will be online by September, giving us a full 3 months to iron out any issues before the holiday rush." Marcus's frown deepened. September to December was 3 months, yes, but that assumed everything went perfectly. And in his experience, nothing ever went perfectly when it came to large-scale logistics operations. He'd learned that lesson the hard way during his 8 years working in warehouse management before he became a driver. He'd started as a loading dock supervisor, worked his way up to operations coordinator, and eventually managed an entire distribution center. He knew how long these things really took. But it wasn't his place to say anything. He was her driver, not her business advisor. "The permits are already approved," Evelyn said, her voice confident. "Construction starts next month. We'll be ahead of schedule if anything." Marcus caught a red light and came to a stop. In the rearview mirror, he could see Evelyn's reflection. She looked calm and sure of herself, the way she always did. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with her numbers. He'd seen this before. Executives who'd never worked on the ground level, making assumptions about how fast things could really happen. It wasn't their fault. They just didn't know what they didn't know. The light was still red. Marcus glanced at the clock on the dashboard. They had 5 minutes before her meeting started. He shouldn't say anything. It wasn't his job, and Evelyn Carter was smart. Smarter than most people he'd ever met. If there was a problem with the timeline, she would have caught it already. But $100 million was a lot of money. And if he was right about the timeline being too tight. The light turned green, but Marcus didn't accelerate right away. A car behind him honked. "Excuse me," he said quietly. Evelyn looked up from her papers. Yes, his heart was beating faster than it should have been. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about the logistics timeline." She blinked, clearly surprised. In 3 months, he'd never interrupted one of her calls before. "There might be a small issue with the September completion date," he continued, his voice careful and respectful. "With the permit approval process and seasonal construction delays, it usually takes closer to 6 months for this type of facility to come online." Evelyn stared at him for a moment. Another car honked behind them. "Thank you, Marcus," she said politely. "But we've done extensive research on this. The timeline is accurate." She returned to her call, dismissing him with the same gentle firmness she used with everyone else. Marcus nodded and pressed the accelerator. He'd said his piece. That was all he could do. But as he drove through the busy downtown streets, he kept thinking about the seasonal construction delays that always hit around August. The permit backlogs that happened every summer when half the city tried to start new projects at the same time. The supply chain issues that could add weeks to any timeline. He'd seen it happen over and over again during his years in warehouse operations. Projects that looked perfect on paper, but fell apart when they hit the real world. They pulled up in front of the glass office tower where Evelyn worked. She was still on her phone, still confident, still completely in control. "I'll see you after the meeting," she said as he opened her door. "Good luck, Ms. Carter." She smiled at him. That same polite, professional smile she always gave him. Then she walked through the revolving glass doors and disappeared into the building. Marcus sat in his car for a few minutes, watching people in expensive suits hurry up and down the sidewalk. He hoped he was wrong about the timeline. He hoped Evelyn's research was better than his experience. He hoped she wouldn't need luck. But he had a bad feeling that she was about to. 20 minutes later, Evelyn Carter sat at the head of a polished conference table, surrounded by 7 investors and 3 of her top executives. The presentation had gone perfectly. The numbers were solid, the projections were conservative, and everyone in the room could see the potential for massive returns. "The logistics infrastructure will be fully operational by September 15th, she said, advancing to her final slide. "That gives us 11 weeks before Black Friday to optimize operations and ensure we're ready for the holiday shopping surge." Thomas Chen, the lead investor, nodded approvingly. "The timeline is aggressive but achievable. We like that." Evelyn's CFO, Linda Shaw, passed contracts around the table. "All the permit approvals are already in place. Construction crews are standing by to begin next Monday." But as Evelyn watched the investors flip through the contracts, something Marcus had said in the car kept nagging at her. 6 months instead of 4. Seasonal construction delays. She pushed the thought away. Marcus was a driver, not a logistics expert. She had MBA graduates on her team who'd spent weeks researching every detail of this timeline. "Are there any questions before we proceed?" Evelyn asked. Robert Kim, another investor, raised his hand. "What's your contingency plan if construction runs longer than expected?" "We've built in a 2-week buffer," Linda answered smoothly. "But based on our research, we don't anticipate needing it." Evelyn nodded confidently. But Marcus's words echoed in her mind again. "Usually takes closer to 6 months." "What specific research did you base the timeline on?" Robert pressed. Linda opened her folder. "Industry standards for similar facilities, regional construction data, and consultant recommendations." From consultants who've actually managed warehouse construction in this region. There was a pause. A very small pause. But Evelyn caught it. Our consultants have extensive experience with commercial construction projects, Linda said. That wasn't exactly an answer to the question. Evelyn felt a small knot forming in her stomach. Could you be more specific about their warehouse experience? Thomas asked. Another pause. Evelyn's mind was racing now. She thought about Marcus's calm, quiet voice in the car. The way he'd hesitated before speaking up. The way he'd said, "in my experience," without explaining what that experience was. "You know what?" she said, standing up suddenly. "Could we take a 5-minute break? I want to double-check one small detail before we finalize everything." The investors looked surprised, but they nodded. Everyone filed out of the conference room, leaving Evelyn alone with her notes. She grabbed her phone and called the consulting firm they'd hired for the timeline analysis. It took 3 minutes of being transferred before she reached the project manager. "I need to verify the background of the consultant who provided our construction timeline," she said. "Of course, that would be David Morrison. He has 15 years of experience with large-scale commercial construction. Specifically, warehouse and distribution facilities?" There was a pause. "His background is primarily office buildings and retail centers." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "Has he ever managed a warehouse construction project?" "Not specifically warehouses, no, but the principles are similar." She hung up and immediately called another number. A construction company she'd worked with on a smaller project last year. "Hey, Jim. It's Evelyn Carter. Quick question. If I wanted to build a 200 square foot distribution center, what's a realistic timeline from permit approval to full operation?" "Full operation? You're looking at 6 to 8 months minimum. Maybe longer if you hit any snags with inspections or supply delays." "What if we started construction next month?" "In June? You'd be hitting construction season. Labor gets tight. Materials get backlogged. I'd say closer to 8 months to be safe." Evelyn closed her eyes. 8 months would put them at February. Missing Black Friday completely. Missing Christmas. Missing the entire holiday shopping season that generated 40% of their annual revenue. She called one more number, then another. Every answer was the same. 6 months minimum. 8 months more realistic. No one thought 4 months was possible. Marcus had been right. The door opened and Linda poked her head in. "They're ready to continue." Evelyn stared at the contracts on the table. Millions of dollars. Hundreds of jobs. The biggest deal of her career. All based on a timeline that was apparently impossible. "Actually," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I need to discuss something with the team first." It took 2 hours to untangle everything. 2 hours of phone calls, calculations, and very uncomfortable conversations with investors who'd been ready to sign. The real timeline made the deal completely unworkable. By the time the facilities were operational, they'd have missed the holiday season. The revenue projections would be off by millions. The return on investment would be cut in half. The investors left without signing. Thomas Chen was polite, but firm. "Come back when you have realistic numbers, Evelyn. We appreciate your ambition. But we need accuracy." Linda was frustrated. How did our consultants get this so wrong? Evelyn's father called 20 minutes after the investors left. Word traveled fast in their industry. "What happened in there?" Thomas Carter's voice was sharp through the phone. "I heard the deal fell through." "We had incorrect timeline projections," Evelyn said simply. "How do you have incorrect projections? This is what we pay consultants for." The consultant had experience with office buildings, not warehouses. There's a difference. A difference that cost us $100 million deal? Evelyn closed her eyes. It would have cost us a lot more if we'd signed those contracts and then couldn't deliver. There was silence on the other end. Her father was thinking, calculating, probably figuring out how much this mistake would cost the company's reputation. "We'll discuss this later," he said finally. "Come to dinner Sunday. We need to talk." He hung up without saying goodbye. Evelyn sat alone in her office as the sun set outside her window. Her computer screen glowed with emails from team members trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Her phone buzzed with text messages from colleagues who'd heard about the failed deal. But all she could think about was Marcus in the car that morning. His quiet, respectful voice. The way he'd hesitated before speaking up. The way he'd said, there might be a small issue, when it turned out to be a massive issue that could have destroyed her company. At 7:30, she took the elevator down to the parking garage. Marcus was waiting by his car, reading something on his phone. When he saw her approaching, he stood up and opened the door. "How did it go?" he asked. Evelyn paused before getting into the car. She looked at this man who'd driven her around for 3 months. This man she'd politely dismissed that morning when he tried to save her from making the biggest mistake of her career. "You were right," she said simply. "The timeline was wrong. Very wrong." Marcus's expression didn't change. He didn't look smug or satisfied. He just nodded and waited for her to sit down. As they pulled out of the parking garage, Evelyn found herself really looking at Marcus for the first time. Not just as her driver, but as a person. Someone who clearly knew more about logistics than her expensive consultants did. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "How did you know about construction timelines?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I used to work in warehouse operations. 8 years. Started on a loading dock and worked my way up to managing an entire distribution center." "What happened? Why did you stop?" Another pause. "I kept trying to point out problems with projects and timelines, like I did this morning. But after a while, I realized most people don't want to hear that kind of feedback from someone like me." "Someone like you?" "Someone without a college degree. Someone who started at the bottom. Someone whose opinion doesn't carry much weight in conference rooms." They stopped at a red light. In the rearview mirror, Evelyn could see Marcus's eyes, calm, intelligent, and a little sad. "So I stopped speaking up," he continued. "Found a job where I could make decent money, without having to watch people make mistakes I could have prevented." "But you spoke up today." "I did." "Why?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. The light turned green and they continued through the city. "Because you seem like someone who actually cares about getting things right," he said finally. "And $100 million is a lot of money to lose over bad math." Evelyn sat back in her seat, processing everything. This quiet, respectful man who opened her car door every morning and never said more than was necessary had probably just saved her company millions of dollars. Maybe saved her entire career, and she'd almost dismissed him completely. "Thank you," she said. "Just doing my job." "No," Evelyn said firmly. "This was above and beyond your job. Way above and beyond." They pulled up in front of her townhouse. But instead of getting out immediately like she usually did, Evelyn sat in the car for a moment. "Marcus," she said, "would you mind staying nearby tomorrow? I have a feeling I'm going to need someone with actual logistics experience to help clean up this mess." In the mirror, she saw the smallest hint of a smile cross his face. "I'll be here," he said. As Evelyn walked up to her front door, she realized something that should have been obvious months ago. She'd been so focused on surrounding herself with people who had impressive degrees and fancy titles that she'd completely missed the person with actual knowledge sitting right behind her every single day. Tomorrow, she was going to start paying attention. The next morning came too early. Evelyn had barely slept, her mind spinning with damage control strategies and the uncomfortable realization that she'd nearly made a catastrophic mistake. She stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching Marcus pull up to the curb at exactly 6:15. But today felt different. As she walked to the car, she found herself really looking at him. The way he stood straighter when he saw her coming. The careful attention he paid to opening her door at just the right angle. The quiet dignity in everything he did. "Good morning, Marcus." "Morning, Miss Carter. How are you holding up?" The question caught her off guard. In 3 months, he'd never asked about her well-being before. But then again, she'd never had a day quite like yesterday. "I'm okay," she said, settling into the back seat, ready to figure out how to fix this mess. As they pulled away from her townhouse, Evelyn found herself paying attention to things she'd never noticed before. The way Marcus checked his mirrors constantly, always aware of everything happening around them. The classical music playing softly from the radio. The small air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror that smelled like pine trees. "Can I ask you something else about yesterday?" she said. "Sure." "When you worked in warehouse operations, did you run into this kind of thing often? Unrealistic timelines?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, navigating through the morning traffic. "More than I'd like to remember. Executives would come in with plans that looked great on paper but ignored how things actually worked on the ground. Did you always try to speak up?" "At first, yeah. I thought people wanted to know if there were problems. I thought they'd appreciate someone catching mistakes before they became expensive." "But they didn't?" "Sometimes they did. But more often, I'd get told that I was being negative or that I didn't understand the big picture. After a while, I learned it was easier to just do my job and let other people make the decisions." Evelyn felt a familiar knot in her stomach. How many Marcus Hills had she dismissed over the years? How many people with real experience had tried to help her, only to be politely ignored because they didn't have the right credentials? Her phone buzzed. Linda Shaw. "The investors want a conference call this afternoon," Evelyn said after reading the text. "They're giving us a chance to come back with revised numbers. That's good news." "Is it? I'm not sure we can make the math work with a realistic timeline." Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Would you like me to take a look at the numbers? I might be able to suggest some alternatives." Evelyn hesitated. Her first instinct was to say no. Marcus was her driver, not a business consultant. What would Linda think? What would her father say? But then she remembered yesterday's disaster. "Actually, yes, I'd really appreciate that." They spent the drive to her office going over the basic details of the deal. Marcus listened carefully, asking questions that showed he understood not just the logistics, but the financial implications. When had her driver become smarter than her consultants? When they arrived at the office building, Evelyn made an impulsive decision. "Would you mind coming upstairs with me? I'd like you to look at the full proposal." Marcus looked surprised. "Are you sure?" "Very sure." The elevator ride to the 20th floor was quiet. Evelyn could see Marcus taking in the marble floors, the expensive artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. This was a world he'd probably never experienced from the inside. "Ms. Carter," Nina Brooks, her executive assistant, stood up as they approached. Her eyes flicked curiously between Evelyn and Marcus. "Nina, this is Marcus Hill. He's going to be helping us with some logistics analysis today. Could you set him up with a workspace and get him copies of the warehouse project files?" Nina blinked but didn't question it. "Of course. Conference room B is available." An hour later, Marcus was spread out over a conference table covered with blueprints, timelines, and financial projections. Evelyn watched him work, fascinated by how quickly he absorbed information. He made notes in neat handwriting, cross-referenced different documents, and occasionally pulled out his phone to make quick calls. "Who are you calling?" she asked during one of his phone breaks. "Construction foreman, I know. Just checking current material costs and crew availability." Of course, he actually knew people in the industry. Real people who did the actual work. Linda Shaw arrived around 10:30 for their emergency strategy meeting. She stopped short when she saw Marcus at the conference table. "Evelyn, what's going on here?" "Marcus is helping us with the logistics analysis. He has extensive warehouse experience." Linda's expression was carefully neutral. I see. And his background is 8 years in warehouse operations and distribution management, Marcus said calmly, not looking up from his notes. Right. Linda's tone was polite, but skeptical. And where did you work most recently? Peterson Distribution. I managed their main facility for 3 years before moving to corporate transportation. Evelyn could see the wheels turning in Linda's head. She was calculating whether Marcus's experience was worth the awkwardness of having a driver involved in executive decision-making. What have you found? Evelyn asked Marcus. He looked up from his notes. The original timeline was definitely impossible. But if we modify the approach, we might be able to make it work. How? Marcus stood up and walked to the whiteboard. Without asking permission, he started drawing a simple diagram. Instead of building 2 large facilities simultaneously, we build one facility in 2 phases. Phase 1 gets us operational in 5 months instead of 4, but we can handle 60% of the projected volume. Phase 2 comes online 3 months later, bringing us to full capacity just before the following holiday season. He drew timeline bars showing the phases. The initial investment is smaller, the risk is lower, and we actually end up with better cash flow because we start generating revenue sooner. Linda was staring at the whiteboard. That actually makes sense. There's more, Marcus continued. If we choose the right location for Phase 1, we can negotiate better rates with shipping companies because we're not competing with other projects for labor and materials. He pulled out his phone and showed them a notes app filled with contact names and numbers. I called 3 shipping coordinators this morning. If we commit to Phase 1 by next Friday, we can lock in rates that are 15% lower than your original projections. Evelyn felt her heart beating faster. Not only was Marcus's plan more realistic, it might actually be more profitable than their original proposal. What about the investors? Linda asked. They wanted full operation by holiday season. They wanted profits, Marcus corrected gently. This approach gives them profits sooner and reduces their risk. Most investors prefer that to ambitious timelines that might not work. Linda looked at Evelyn, then back at Marcus. I have to admit, this is solid thinking. For the next 2 hours, the 3 of them worked through Marcus's proposal, running numbers and refining details. Marcus's phone seemed to have contacts for every aspect of warehouse logistics. Contractors, suppliers, equipment rental companies, even local permit offices. How do you know all these people? Evelyn asked during a break. 8 years is a long time in a small industry. You meet people, you help each other out, you stay in touch. Marcus shrugged. Most of warehouse logistics comes down to relationships. At 1 o'clock, Evelyn called the investors and asked if they could move their conference call to 3 o'clock. She needed time to prepare the revised proposal. You think they'll go for it? Linda asked as she gathered up her papers. I think it's our only shot, Evelyn replied. After Linda left, Evelyn found herself alone with Marcus in the conference room. He was tidying up his notes, stacking papers in neat piles. Marcus, she said, I owe you an enormous apology. He looked up, surprised. For what? For dismissing you yesterday morning. For never asking about your background. For assuming that someone who drives a car for a living couldn't possibly know anything about business. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You don't need to apologize. Most people make the same assumption. That doesn't make it right. Maybe not, but it's understandable. Evelyn shook her head. No, it's not. It's lazy thinking, and it almost cost my company millions of dollars. She walked to the window and looked down at the street below. People in suits hurrying to lunch meetings. Delivery trucks navigating traffic. A complex ecosystem of work that she'd never really thought about before. Can I ask you something? She said, turning back to Marcus. Sure. Why did you become a driver? If you had all this experience and knowledge, why didn't you start your own consulting company? Or work for another logistics firm? Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. I tried that for a while. After I left Peterson, I applied for management positions at other companies. I had good references, solid experience, proven results. What happened? I'd get through the phone interviews fine. My resume looked good on paper, but when I showed up for in-person interviews, he gestured at himself. Well, I'm not what most executives picture when they think of a logistics consultant. Evelyn felt a flush of shame. She knew exactly what he meant. So I decided to find work where I could make decent money without having to convince anyone that I belonged there. Driving pays well enough, and I don't have to deal with conference rooms full of people questioning my competence. But that's such a waste of your talent. Marcus smiled, but it was a sad smile. Maybe, but it's also peace of mind. I get up. I drive good people to important meetings. I go home. No politics, no proving myself, no watching people make mistakes I could prevent, but aren't allowed to. Except yesterday. Except yesterday. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the whiteboard covered with Marcus's neat diagrams and timeline calculations. The conference call is in 2 hours, Evelyn said finally. You'll do great. The numbers are solid now. Will you stay for it? I might need someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Marcus looked uncertain. I don't think the investors would appreciate getting business advice from a driver. Then don't tell them you're a driver. Tell them you're a logistics consultant. But I'm not. You are now. The conference call went better than anyone had expected. The investors loved the phased approach. They appreciated the reduced risk and the faster path to profitability. Thomas Chen was particularly impressed with the detailed cost breakdowns and supplier relationships. This is exactly the kind of thorough analysis we were hoping to see, he said through the speakerphone. Who did you bring in to revise the logistics planning? Evelyn glanced at Marcus, who was sitting quietly at the end of the conference table. Marcus Hill. He has extensive experience in warehouse operations and distribution. Well, Mr. Hill certainly knows his business. We'd like to move forward with this revised proposal. After the call ended, Linda was practically glowing. That was incredible. They're not just back in, they're more excited than they were yesterday. Nina appeared in the doorway. Ms. Carter, your father is here to see you. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She'd been hoping to postpone the conversation with her father until after she had good news to share. Thomas Carter appeared behind Nina, his expression unreadable. He was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room. Evelyn, he said, his eyes scanning the conference room. They landed on Marcus, who had stood up respectfully when Thomas entered. Dad, I was just about to call you. The deal is back on. Actually, it's better than before. Is that right? Thomas's voice was carefully neutral. And who's this? This is Marcus Hill. He's the one who caught the timeline error and helped us restructure the entire proposal. Thomas looked Marcus up and down, taking in his neat suit, his respectful posture, his quiet confidence. Mr. Hill, what company are you with? There was a moment of silence. Evelyn could see Marcus weighing his options. She was about to jump in and explain when he spoke for himself. I work for your daughter, sir. I'm her driver, but I have 8 years of experience in warehouse operations. Thomas blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Her driver. Yes, sir. And you restructured a $100 million deal. I made some suggestions based on my experience. Ms. Carter and Ms. Shaw did the real work. Thomas looked at Evelyn, then back at Marcus, then at the whiteboard covered with calculations and timelines. Well, he said finally, that's unusual. But effective, Evelyn said quickly. The investors are ready to sign. The numbers are better than our original proposal. Thomas nodded slowly. I see. Mr. Hill, could you give us a moment alone? Of course. Marcus gathered his papers and walked toward the door. "I'll be downstairs whenever you're ready, Ms. Carter." After he left, Thomas turned to his daughter. "Do you want to explain to me what just happened here?" Evelyn took a deep breath. "What happened is that I almost made a terrible mistake because I was listening to the wrong people, and I almost ignored the right person because I made assumptions about what he could know based on what he did for work. So your driver saved a $100 million deal. My driver has more real-world logistics experience than anyone else we've consulted with. And yes, he saved the deal." Thomas was quiet for a long time, processing this information. "You know people are going to talk about this," he said finally. "Let them talk. The board is going to have questions about your judgment, about why you're taking business advice from your driver." Evelyn felt a flash of anger. "I'm taking business advice from someone who knows what he's talking about. If the board has a problem with that, they can look at the results." "Evelyn." "No, Dad. I'm tired of pretending that titles and degrees matter more than actual knowledge. I'm tired of hiring consultants who sound impressive, but don't know the difference between office construction and warehouse construction. Marcus Hill just saved this company millions of dollars, and I don't care what anyone thinks about that." Thomas stared at his daughter for a long moment. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. "You sound like your mother," he said finally. "What do you mean?" "She used to say that the smartest people she knew were the ones who actually did the work, not the ones who just talked about it." Thomas smiled slightly. She would have liked Mr. Hill. Evelyn felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Her mother had died when she was 16, and her father rarely mentioned her anymore. "So you're not angry about this?" "I'm proud of you for listening when it mattered, and I'm curious about Mr. Hill." Thomas paused. "Do you trust him?" "More than I trust our expensive consultants, apparently." "Then maybe it's time to think about how to use that trust more strategically." As her father left, Evelyn realized that something fundamental had shifted in how she saw herself and her work. For years, she'd been focused on proving she belonged in executive conference rooms. But maybe the real challenge wasn't proving she belonged at the top. Maybe it was learning to recognize wisdom wherever it came from. 3 weeks had passed since the investor meeting, and Evelyn found herself looking forward to her morning drives with Marcus in a way that surprised her. What had started as practical conversations about the warehouse project had evolved into something deeper. Marcus had insights about business that went far beyond logistics, and Evelyn discovered that his quiet observations often cut straight to the heart of problems she'd been struggling with for months. "The Henderson account is giving us trouble again," she said one morning as they drove through downtown traffic. "They want to renegotiate the shipping rates, even though we signed a contract 6 months ago." "What's their reasoning?" Marcus asked. "They say market conditions have changed. Fuel costs are up. Labor costs are up. They want us to absorb the difference." Marcus was quiet for a moment, navigating around a stopped bus. "How much business do they represent?" "About 12% of our quarterly revenue. Significant, but not enough to sink us if we lose them." "Have you talked to their warehouse managers directly? Not the executives, but the people who actually handle the day-to-day operations?" Evelyn paused. "No, why would I do that?" "Because executives make decisions based on spreadsheets. Warehouse managers make decisions based on relationships. If Henderson's ground-level people are happy with your service, they'll pressure their bosses to find a way to make the numbers work." It was such a simple insight, but it had never occurred to her. All her negotiations happened in conference rooms with people in expensive suits, but the real work happened in warehouses with people in work boots. "You really think that would make a difference?" "I think most business problems are people problems. And people problems get solved by talking to people, not by sending emails back and forth between legal departments." That afternoon, Evelyn drove out to Henderson's main distribution center herself. Marcus had offered to come along, but she wanted to try this approach on her own. She spent 2 hours walking through the facility, talking to shift supervisors, and loading dock coordinators. People were surprised to see the CEO of their shipping company asking about their day-to-day challenges. The warehouse manager, a woman named Carol Peters, was particularly helpful. "Your drivers are the most reliable we work with," Carol said as they watched a delivery truck back up to a loading dock. "Some companies, we never know if they're going to show up on time or if the paperwork will be right. With your people, everything just works." "That's good to hear." "It is. And between you and me, the executives upstairs don't always understand how much that reliability is worth. They just see numbers on a spreadsheet." Evelyn smiled. Marcus had been exactly right. By the end of the week, Henderson had agreed to a compromise on the shipping rates. Carol Peters had put in a good word with her management team, emphasizing how much money the company saved by not having to deal with delivery delays and paperwork errors. "How did you know that would work?" Evelyn asked Marcus on Friday morning. "Because I used to be one of those warehouse managers. I know what we really care about." There it was again. That simple, practical wisdom that came from actually doing the work instead of just managing it. Over the next few days, Evelyn found herself sharing more of her business challenges with Marcus. Not because she had to, but because his perspective was genuinely helpful. He didn't just nod politely like some of her executives did. He asked questions that made her think differently about problems. "You seem more relaxed lately," Nina commented one afternoon as Evelyn returned from a client meeting. "Do I? More confident, maybe. Like you're not carrying as much stress." Evelyn thought about that as she worked through her emails. It was true. Having someone she could talk through problems with, someone who understood both the big picture and the practical details, had made everything feel more manageable, but she also noticed something else happening. The conversations with Marcus were becoming less about business and more about everything else. She found herself telling him about her college years, her complicated relationship with her father, her struggles with feeling like she had to prove herself constantly. And Marcus shared stories too, about growing up with his Uncle Raymond after his parents died, about working his way through community college while managing a warehouse job, about the quiet satisfaction of solving problems that made other people's jobs easier. "Do you ever regret not finishing a 4-year degree?" Evelyn asked one evening as they sat in traffic. "Sometimes. Not because I needed it to do the work, but because it would have made other people take me more seriously." "That's terrible." "It's reality. You can be the smartest person in the room, but if you don't have the right credentials, people assume you don't belong there." Evelyn thought about all the meetings she'd sat through where the person with the most impressive resume dominated the conversation, even when their ideas weren't particularly good. "I used to think credentials mattered because they proved competence," she said. "But now I think they just prove that someone had access to education, which isn't the same thing at all. You're learning." There was something about the way he said it that made her look at him more carefully in the rearview mirror. His eyes met hers for just a moment, before he returned his attention to the road. That night, Evelyn found herself thinking about Marcus long after she'd gotten home. Not just his insights about business, but the person behind those insights. His quiet strength, his lack of ego despite having every reason to be bitter about how he'd been treated. The way he listened without judgment when she vented about her father's expectations or Linda's occasional condescension. When had her driver become the person she most looked forward to talking to each day? The shift happened gradually, so gradually that Evelyn didn't notice it at first. But Linda Shaw noticed. "You've been spending a lot of time with your driver," Linda said during their weekly finance review meeting. "Marcus has been helpful with the warehouse project. He knows the industry." "Right, but people are starting to talk." Evelyn looked up from her reports. "Talk about what?" "About boundaries, about professionalism, about whether it's appropriate for you to be consulting with him on business matters. He's prevented at least 2 major mistakes in the past month. I'd say that's pretty professional." Linda's expression was carefully neutral. "I'm not questioning his competence. I'm questioning the optics." "The optics?" "Evelyn, you're a young female CEO in a male-dominated industry. Every decision you make gets scrutinized twice as hard as it would for a man. Having intimate business discussions with your driver, it sends the wrong message. Evelyn felt heat rising in her cheeks. What message is that, Linda? That you're not confident enough to trust your actual executives, that you need guidance from outside sources. The pause before outside sources was loaded with implications that made Evelyn's stomach turn. Marcus has more practical experience than anyone else on our team. Maybe. But perception matters as much as reality in this business. You know that. After Linda left, Evelyn sat alone in her office feeling frustrated and confused. Was Linda right about the optics? Had she been relying too heavily on Marcus's advice? Was she making herself look weak or unprofessional? But then she thought about the Henderson account, about the warehouse project that was now running ahead of schedule and under budget, about the 3 other client problems that Marcus had helped her solve with his straightforward, practical approach. Results mattered more than perception. Didn't they? That evening, as Marcus drove her home, Evelyn found herself being more formal than usual, more distant. She answered his questions about her day with short, professional responses, instead of the detailed conversations they'd been having. Marcus noticed the change immediately. "Everything okay today?" he asked, as they stopped at a red light. "Fine, just tired." But it wasn't fine. The easy warmth that had developed between them felt strained and awkward. Evelyn caught herself overanalyzing every word, every glance, every moment of comfortable silence. By the time they reached her townhouse, the tension was thick enough to cut. "Ms. Carter," Marcus said as she reached for the door handle. "Did I do something wrong?" The question caught her off guard. There was something vulnerable in his voice that she'd never heard before. "No," she said quickly. "You haven't done anything wrong." "Then what's going on? You've been different today." Evelyn sat with her hand on the door handle, looking at Marcus in the rearview mirror. His eyes were concerned, maybe even hurt. "Someone made a comment about how much time we've been spending discussing business, about whether it looks appropriate." Understanding crossed Marcus's face immediately. "I see." "It's not that I agree with them," Evelyn said quickly. It's just that you have a reputation to protect." "That's not what I meant." But Marcus was already nodding, his expression closing off. "No, I get it. I should have realized this would become an issue eventually." "Marcus, it's okay, Ms. Carter. Really? I'll keep our conversations more professional going forward." He was being polite, understanding, completely reasonable, which somehow made Evelyn feel worse. "That's not what I want," she said quietly. "But it's what you need." The next morning, Marcus was waiting by the car at exactly 6:15, just like always. But when Evelyn got in, something fundamental had changed. He was polite, professional, and completely distant. Gone were the easy conversations, the shared insights, the comfortable silences that had become the best part of her day. "Good morning, Ms. Carter." "Good morning, Marcus." And that was it. 20 minutes of driving through the city in near total silence. It continued for 3 days. 3 days of Marcus treating her with the same respectful, distant professionalism he'd shown during his first week on the job. 3 days of Evelyn missing their conversations more than she cared to admit. On Thursday morning, she made a decision. "I miss talking to you," she said as they sat in traffic. Marcus's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "Ms. Carter, I miss your insights about business. I miss your stories about your Uncle Raymond. I miss having someone to talk to who actually listens instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. You have plenty of executives who can advise you. None of them are half as smart as you are, and none of them see problems the way you do." Marcus was quiet for a long time. "People are going to keep talking. Let them talk. Your reputation. My reputation should be based on results, and the results speak for themselves. The warehouse project is ahead of schedule. Our client relationships are stronger. Our logistics costs are down 15% from last quarter. Those things would have happened anyway. No, they wouldn't have, and we both know it. They'd reached her office building, but neither of them moved to get out of the car. "Marcus," Evelyn said finally, "I don't care what people think about me getting business advice from my driver. I care about making good decisions and treating smart people with respect. If that makes me look unprofessional to some people, then maybe they're not the kind of people I want to impress anyway." In the mirror, she saw something shift in Marcus's expression. A tiny crack in the professional wall he'd built up over the past 3 days. "Are you sure about that?" "I'm sure. Because once we cross back over this line, it's going to be harder to uncross it again." There was something in the way he said it that made Evelyn's heart beat faster. Something that suggested they weren't just talking about business advice anymore. "Maybe I don't want to uncross it," she said softly. For a long moment, they just looked at each other in the mirror. Then Marcus smiled, and the warmth that had been missing for 3 days came flooding back. "In that case," he said, "I have some thoughts about the Mitchell account that you might want to hear." And just like that, they were back to talking. But something had shifted between them. Something that felt less like a professional relationship, and more like something neither of them was quite ready to name yet. 2 months had passed since the warehouse project began, and it was running so smoothly that other companies were calling to ask who Evelyn's logistics consultant was. She'd started deflecting those questions, not because she was embarrassed about Marcus, but because she'd realized something that made her protective of what they'd built together. Marcus wasn't just helping her with business decisions anymore. He'd become the person she turned to for everything. When her father pressured her about expanding into new markets too quickly, Marcus helped her think through the real costs versus the projected benefits. When Linda questioned her decision to give bonuses to their delivery drivers, Marcus explained why keeping good drivers was worth more than the money they'd save by cutting corners. But it was the smaller moments that had started to matter most. The way Marcus noticed when she was stressed and suggested they stop for coffee before heading to a difficult meeting. The way he remembered that she hated scheduling calls before 9 in the morning and quietly adjusted their routes to give her extra time. The way he listened to her vent about board meetings without trying to fix everything, just letting her work through her frustration out loud. "You know what I realized today?" Evelyn said one evening as they drove home through the quiet streets of downtown. "What's that?" "I actually enjoy going to work now. For the first time since I took over as CEO, I wake up looking forward to the day instead of dreading it." In the rearview mirror, she could see Marcus smile. "That's a good thing." "It is. And it's largely because of you. I think you're giving me too much credit. I don't think I'm giving you enough." They'd fallen into this pattern of gentle argument, each of them downplaying their own importance while building up the other. It felt safe and warm and completely natural. But Evelyn was starting to realize that what she felt for Marcus had moved far beyond professional appreciation. She found herself looking forward to their drives, not because of his business insights, but because she simply enjoyed being near him. She'd started paying attention to small details that had nothing to do with work. The way his hands looked on the steering wheel. The sound of his laugh when she told him stories about her college roommate's dating disasters. The careful way he chose his words when he disagreed with her about something. The realization should have scared her. Marcus worked for her. He was 5 years older than she was. Their backgrounds couldn't have been more different. And despite what she'd told Linda about not caring what people thought, she knew that a relationship between them would create complications she wasn't sure she was ready to handle. But when Marcus smiled at her in the rearview mirror, all those practical concerns seemed less important than the warmth that spread through her chest. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said one morning as they sat in traffic. "Sure. Do you ever think about doing something different? Starting your own consulting business, maybe?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. But starting a business takes capital I don't have and connections I haven't made." "What if you had both?" "What do you mean?" Evelyn had been thinking about this for weeks. What if we partnered on something? You have the expertise. I have the business connections and startup capital. We could create a logistics consulting firm that actually knows what it's talking about. Evelyn. Marcus started, then stopped. It was the first time he'd used her first name instead of calling her Ms. Carter. Think about it. You could be your own boss instead of working for people who don't appreciate what you know. And I could learn from someone who actually understands how business works on the ground level. That would change everything between us. Would that be bad? Marcus met her eyes in the mirror, and for a moment, the air in the car felt charged with possibility. I don't know, he said honestly, but it would definitely be different. That afternoon, Evelyn found herself distracted during a client presentation. She kept thinking about Marcus's expression when she'd suggested they work together. There had been something in his eyes that looked like hope mixed with fear. When the meeting ended, Linda walked with her back to the elevator. You seemed distracted in there, Linda said. Just thinking about some new opportunities. Anything I should know about? Evelyn hesitated. Linda had been supportive of Marcus's consulting help, but a business partnership would be different. More permanent, more personal. I'm thinking about starting a side venture, logistics consulting. That's not a bad idea. There's definitely demand for it. Who would you partner with? Another hesitation. I was thinking about Marcus. Linda stopped walking. Your driver, Marcus? My logistics expert, Marcus. Evelyn. Linda's voice was carefully controlled. Can we talk privately? They found an empty conference room, and Linda closed the door behind them. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, Linda said. Is there something going on between you and Marcus that goes beyond business? Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. The way you light up when he offers an opinion. The way you defer to his judgment even when it contradicts your other advisors. The way you look at him when you think no one is watching. Linda, I'm not judging you. Marcus seems like a good man. But if there are personal feelings involved, you need to think very carefully about whether going into business with him is wise. Evelyn sat down heavily in one of the conference chairs. I don't know what I feel. Yes, you do. You're just afraid to admit it. The honesty in Linda's voice cut through all of Evelyn's careful self-deception. Okay, yes, I have feelings for him. But that doesn't mean I would make bad business decisions because of those feelings. It means you might make personal decisions that complicate your business life, and his. What do you mean? Linda sat down across from her. Evelyn, you're a wealthy white woman who runs a company. Marcus is a black man who drives cars for a living. If you start a relationship with him, people are going to assume he's using you for money or advancement, and they're going to assume you're having some kind of crisis or rebellion. That's horrible. That's reality, and it's not fair to either of you. Evelyn stared out the conference room window at the city skyline. She knew Linda was right about how people would react. She'd been naive to think otherwise. But that doesn't mean the feelings aren't real, Linda continued, or that they're wrong. It just means you need to be honest about what you're both risking if you act on them. That evening, Evelyn found herself paying attention to everything about the drive home. The way Marcus's shoulders relaxed when they left the business district. The way he hummed along softly to the jazz music on the radio. The way he asked about her day, not because he had to, but because he genuinely cared about the answer. When they reached her townhouse, she didn't get out of the car immediately. Marcus, she said, can I ask you something else? Always. Do you think about me when we're not together? The question hung in the air between them. She could see Marcus's hands tighten on the steering wheel. Evelyn, he said quietly, we shouldn't. That's not what I asked. A long pause. Yes, I think about you. What do you think? I think about how smart you are, how you listen to people instead of just waiting for your turn to talk, How you changed your entire approach to business because you cared more about getting things right than about being right. What else? I think about how you laugh at my uncle's stories even though you've never met him. How you remember that I don't like coffee but I love hot chocolate. How you look when you're really concentrating on a problem. His voice was getting softer, more personal. I think about what it would be like if we weren't. If we weren't what? If we weren't who we are. If the circumstances were different. Evelyn turned around in her seat so she could face him directly instead of looking at his reflection. What if we decided that the circumstances don't matter as much as how we feel? Marcus met her eyes, and she could see the conflict there. Want and fear and something deeper that made her heart race. Evelyn, if we cross this line, there's no going back. People will talk. They'll make assumptions about both of us. Your reputation, your career. I'm tired of making decisions based on what other people might think. But the consequences would be real. So are my feelings. They sat in silence for a long moment. The space between them charged with everything they weren't saying. Finally, Marcus spoke. What are you asking me? I'm asking if you feel the same way I do. And if you do, I'm asking if you're willing to figure out what that means together. Even if it's complicated? Especially if it's complicated. The best things usually are. Marcus was quiet for so long that Evelyn started to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. Then he smiled, and it was different from any smile she'd seen from him before. Warmer, more open, more like the person he was when he wasn't being careful about professional boundaries. Okay, he said simply. Okay? Okay, let's figure out what this means together. Evelyn felt something tight in her chest loosen and expand. Really? Really. But we need to be smart about it. How do you mean? I mean we take our time. We're honest about what we're both risking, and we don't let anyone pressure us into moving faster or slower than feels right to us. I can live with that, and we keep talking to each other. About everything. The good stuff and the hard stuff, and the stuff that scares us. Deal. Marcus reached across the space between them and took her hand. It was the first time they'd touched outside of the formal handshakes and door-holding of their professional relationship. His hand was warm and strong and calloused from years of real work. Hers was soft and smooth and trembling slightly with nervousness and excitement. This is going to be interesting, he said. Evelyn laughed, and it came out higher and more breathless than usual. That's one word for it. Are you scared? Terrified. You? Same. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. But good scared. Like the feeling you get before you do something you know is going to change everything. Is that what this is? I think so. Do you mind? Evelyn looked at their joined hands, then up at Marcus's face. He was looking at her like she was something precious and surprising, like a gift he hadn't expected to receive. No, she said. I don't mind at all. When she finally got out of the car and walked up to her front door, Evelyn felt like she was floating. Everything looked different. The familiar street, the evening sky, even her own reflection in her front door window. The same, but somehow more vibrant. Behind her, she could hear Marcus's car pulling away from the curb. But for the first time, the sound of him leaving didn't make her feel lonely. Because tomorrow morning he'd be back, and they'd have all day to figure out what came next. As she unlocked her door and stepped inside, Evelyn realized that Linda had been right about one thing. She was definitely scared about what people would think and say, but she was more scared of spending the rest of her life wondering what might have been if she'd been brave enough to find out. Tomorrow, she decided, was going to be the beginning of something entirely new.